All right. Welcome back, everybody. Going to do the lecture for Unit 7. So, Unit 7 deals pretty specifically with the major trade routes in Eurasia, right? These trade routes are going to play a massive role in period 3, the post-classical era, which is coming up. So, I want to make sure that we address them, their importance, how they integrate all of these different empires, all of these different cultures, all of these different religions that we're going to be discussing here in the upcoming units. Um, Trade plays an incredibly important role in bringing diversity, in bringing diffusion, right? The spread of cultural, political, technical, social ways and means um, that really can't be understated. Now, in this specific lecture, we're going to focus on the big three: Silk Road, Indian Ocean, or what you're going to hear me call the IO trade, and the sand roads. Okay. So, as you can see for the recommended supplemental viewing for this one, as always, I recommend you go to Crash Course. All three of these episodes deal with one of the major trade routes, but as is Crash Course's way, it takes a big picture look at things. It talks about how they are able to not only diffuse but also create blends, what we call syncretism within cultural and political traditions. So each one of those videos is highly recommended. It's going to echo a lot of the things that you hear in this lecture. So, like I said, we're going to focus mainly on the big three in terms of the classical and the post-classical trade routes. Again, the Silk Road, the IO trade, and the sand roads. But I want to make sure that you don't leave this unit with this idea that somehow these are the only three trade networks out there, and that if you're not part of this trade network, your society in the classical and post-classical era is somehow being left out. Um, there's many smaller regional trade networks, each of them connecting to the major trade routes in some way, shape, or form. In some cases, some of these networks at one point were bigger than any of the big three. The Mediterranean trade network, especially under the Greeks and under the Romans, was one of the largest in the world. But with the, you know, enhancement of the Silk Road and the expansion of the Indian Ocean trade network, the Mediterranean trade starts to slacken off, especially after the end of the Roman Empire. Um, but some of these other trade routes, you have the Mediterranean network, you have what's known as the Viking lanes in Northern Europe, the Pochteca roads and the Andean network in the Americas, the Black Sea network, which is essentially Russia's connection to the rest of the world. In Europe, you have what's known as the Hanseatic League. This is a kind of trade collective that develops in Europe where specific towns join the league and merchants are able to kind of purchase membership, um, get discounts on goods. Essentially, it's like a medieval kind of Sam's Club, okay, where members of the league enjoy certain privileges, and the league pools resources to, build necessary infrastructure, protect the trade routes, things like that. And then going even back further in the classical era, you have the Nile River and the Red Sea routes. So just taking a quick look, these are essentially your big three here. This is the Silk Road, this is the Sand Roads, this is the Indian Ocean trade. Again, however, there are very important trade networks that develop regionally that are smaller, but are just as important in terms of getting goods and diffusing culture and ideas into the specific regions. On the left here, you have a breakdown of the members of the Hanseatic League as well as some of the bigger routes. You also have the Viking trade routes in Europe, where Northern Europeans would not only trade but often raid and invade Europe through these same routes. Also, again, like we talked about, you have the Mediterranean network, which connects pretty much Europe to the remainder of North Africa and the Middle East. These trade networks and these trade routes are going to become really significant around 1000 CE and beyond there. These are going to be the routes that the Crusades take to the Middle East when we start talking about that, as well as in the 13th, 14th century. This is what's going to give rise to very powerful city states in Italy, like Venice, Florence, Naples. And this is going to be one of the main causes or main reasons for the beginning of the Italian and then European Renaissance. Now, smaller and not as significant as the other trade routes, you have the Red Sea and the Nile trade, which flourished more in the classical era under the Egyptian monarchies, Axum, Kush, and Meroe. Also in the Americas, you had more regional trade routes. The book, talks about how long distance trade between South America, North America, Mesoamerica really didn't, exist on the same scale that it did in Eurasia. But there were some very important regional trade routes along the Mississippi River in North America, all throughout Mesoamerica, and then along the west coast of South America in the Inca and Moche civilizations.